Do you hear it? The echoes of the past, the whispers of forgotten truths, fragments of memories lost in the shadows. Welcome to Brainrot, Echoes, where we bring you stories long buried, unravel mysteries cloaked by time, and guide you through the darkest corners of the mind and the universe. Each video is more than just content. It's an echo resonating deep within, urging you to question, to wonder, to explore. Backend index pointing right, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us in listening to the echoes the world tried to silence. The Peace Lesson, Part 1, The Offer They Couldn't Refuse. So let me get this straight, Admiral Arya Vance said, tapping her finger on the titanium alloy table. Her voice was soft, but her cold blue eyes could make even a dying star shiver. You're telling me that your entire armada, what was it, 3,000 ships? 3,000 ships just ran away because of one human vessel. The Keth'var ambassador, a 7-foot-tall reptilian creature whose green scales were currently displaying what could only be described as extreme anxiety, shifted uncomfortably in his specially designed chair. His 4 compound eyes darted between Vance and the object currently sitting on the conference table like the galaxy's most inappropriate centerpiece. Admiral Vance, the Keth'var ambassador began, his translator struggling with what sounded like clicks and hisses. Perhaps we could discuss this matter without the visual aid. Vance gently stroked the skull of General Graken, the former commander of the Keth'var invasion fleet. His petrified expression was permanently frozen in what looked like a mixture of surprise and deep regret. The kind of regret you get when you realize you've just made a career-ending decision that happened to be your last decision ever. Oh, this old thing. Vance picked up the skull by one of its horn-like protrusions and gave it a little shake. I thought it might add some atmosphere to our little chat. You know, help set the mood for your surrender negotiations. The ambassador's scales shifted to what might have been called a deeply uncomfortable chartreuse. Admiral, we are here to discuss your surrender, not ours. Right. Vance put the skull down with a casual thump. My surrender to you, the guys who just lost their entire fleet to a single human ship. I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with the logistics here. Could you walk me through exactly how this is supposed to work? Now, you might be wondering how we got to this point. How does a single human vessel end up facing down the pride of the Keth'var Empire? How does a conversation about surrender turn into a macabre show-and-tell session? And most importantly, how does a species that considers itself the apex predator of the galaxy end up looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else in the universe? Well, buckle up, because this is going to be one of those stories that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the phrase proportional response. It had started 3 weeks ago when the Keth'var Empire decided to make humanity an offer they couldn't refuse. The problem was they'd apparently never met a human before, because if they had, they'd have known that humans specialize in reluctant offers that can't be refused. The offer came in the form of a transmission to Earth Colonial Defense Force, delivered by a very pompous Keth'var general, who looked like he'd been designed by a committee of people who'd only ever heard insect described secondhand. Humans of Earth, the general had declared, his forearms spread wide in what was probably meant to be an intimidating gesture, but looked more like he was trying to hug a particularly large tree. You will submit to the glory of the Keth'var Empire. Your worlds will become our colonies. Your resources will fuel our expansion. Your people will serve our glorious cause. The message had been received by Admiral Helena Cross, who had the distinction of being both the head of colonial defense and the person least likely in the galaxy to be impressed by dramatic posturing. She'd watched the entire 10-minute ultimatum with the kind of expression usually reserved for someone who just stepped in something unpleasant. So, she'd said to her aide after the transmission ended, they want us to surrender because they said so? That appears to be the gist of it, Admiral. Did they mention any consequences for dissent? Total annihilation, ma'am. The usual. Admiral Cross had sighed the kind of sigh that came from 30 years of dealing with alien species who'd watched too many dramatic holoplays. Send Captain Kalen a message. Tell him to take the horizon out for a little reconnaissance mission. I want to know what we're dealing with." And that's how Captain Kalen Thorne found himself commanding humanity's newest and most experimental warship on what was supposed to be a simple scouting mission. The Horizon was a beauty, sleek, deadly, and packed with enough firepower to level Small Moon. She was also the first human vessel to be equipped with the new quantum tunnel drives, which meant she could pop in and out of subspace like a very aggressive jack-in-the-box. Thorne had been expecting to find a small patrol fleet, maybe a few dozen ships positioned to look intimidating. What he'd found instead was the entire KRYLL First Fleet. 3,000 vessels arranged in a battle formation that stretched across half a solar system. Well, Thorne had said to his bridge crew, "That's new." His tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Lena Petrova, had been staring at her readings like they'd personally offended her. "Captain, I'm reading massive energy signatures. They're not just here for show. Any idea what they're?" "Based on their formation, I'd say they're preparing for a full-scale invasion." "This isn't a patrol fleet, sir. This is a conquest armada." Thorne had nodded slowly. The KRYLL weren't just making threats. They were backing them up with enough firepower to glass a planet, which meant this had just stopped being a reconnaissance mission and started being something else entirely. "Petrova, send a message to Admiral Cross. Tell her we found the KRYLL fleet." "Yes, sir. What about our orders?" Thorne had looked out at the sea of alien warships and felt that familiar tingle that came right before he did something that would probably end up in his personnel file. "Our orders were to scout and report." "Well, we've scouted. Now, let's give them something to report about." What happened next will go down in military history as either the most brilliant tactical maneuver ever conceived or the most spectacular case of someone taking their job description way too literally. The Horizon had dropped out of quantum tunnel space directly in the middle of the KRYLL formation, appearing between their command ship and their primary battle group like a very small, very angry hornet that had just been kicked out of its nest. The reaction was immediate and, from a human perspective, absolutely hilarious. 3,000 KRYLL ships had opened fire simultaneously, creating a light show that could probably be seen from the next galaxy over. The problem was, they'd been so surprised by the sudden appearance of a human vessel that they hadn't bothered to check their firing solutions. What should have been a concentrated barrage that would have vaporized the Horizon instantly instead turned into the galaxy's most expensive friendly fire incident. The KRYLL fleet had spent the next 30 minutes shooting at each other while the Horizon danced between them like a very vindictive butterfly, occasionally popping into quantum tunnel space to appear behind unsuspecting vessels and deliver what Thorne liked to call kinetic love taps to their engines. By the time the dust settled, the KRYLL First Fleet had been reduced to scattered debris, confused radio chatter, and one very dead General Graken, whose flagship had been the first casualty of his own fleet's panic response. Thorne had collected the general's skull as evidence of the encounter because apparently, when you're commanding humanity's most advanced warship in the middle of an interstellar incident, you develop a very particular sense of what constitutes appropriate evidence. Which brought us back to the present moment with Ambassador KRYLL looking like he'd rather be facing down a black hole than continuing this conversation. "Captain Thorne," the ambassador tried again, his translator now adding what sounded like nervous static to his words. "Surely you understand that your single vessel cannot stand against the might of the Keth'var Empire." "You're right," Thorne said, nodding sagely. "One ship against an entire empire. Those are terrible odds." He paused, letting the ambassador's scales shift to what might have been hopeful green for the Empire. "I mean," the color immediately shifted to, "oh crap, red." "See, the thing is," Thorne continued, settling back in his chair like he was about to explain something to a particularly slow child. "You guys seem to have this weird idea that quantity automatically beats quality, which is adorable, really. It's like watching a toddler try to arm wrestle a bodybuilder." Lieutenant Commander Petrova, who'd been standing quietly by the door, couldn't quite suppress a snort of laughter. Thorne shot her a look that clearly said, "professional composure," but his grin suggested he was fighting the same battle. "Captain," Ambassador KRYLL said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was rapidly losing what little patience he'd started with. You destroyed one fleet. The Keth'var Empire has thousands of fleets. Had, Thorn corrected helpfully. You had thousands of fleets. Past tense. The ambassador's 4 eyes blinked in sequence like a biological slot machine that had just come up all question marks. I'm sorry, what? Thorn reached into his jacket and pulled out a data pad, which he slid across the table with all the casual confidence of someone playing poker with a royal flush. Take a look. The ambassador's eyes darted down to the pad, and Thorn watched as his scales went through what looked like the entire visible spectrum before settling on a color that probably didn't have a name in any language. This can't be accurate, Kryll whispered. Oh, it's accurate, Thorn said. See, while you were sending your little fleet to intimidate us, we were doing what humans do best. We were learning, studying, figuring out how your technology works, how your ships are built, how your military thinks. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the kind of conversational tone that somehow made the words hit harder than if he'd been shouting. And you know what we learned? Your entire military doctrine is based on the idea that bigger is always better. More ships, more firepower, more everything. Which works great when you're fighting species that think the same way. The ambassador was still staring at the data pad, like it might spontaneously combust. The 7th Fleet, the 12th Armada, quantum tunnel drives, Thorn said simply. Amazing technology. Lets you pop up anywhere in the galaxy at a moment's notice. Very useful when you want to hit a fleet before they know you're there. Even more useful when you want to hit 12 fleets before any of them know you're there. Petrova stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking just enough to let through a hint of the satisfaction that came from a job well done. Captain, we've received confirmation from Admiral Cross. The last of the Kryll military assets have been neutralized. All of them? Thorn asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Every ship, every station, every orbital platform. The Kryll Empire is officially, well, it's not an empire anymore. Thorn turned back to the ambassador, who was looking like he'd just watched his entire worldview collapse into a singularity. So about that surrender? You destroyed our entire military, Kryll said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every ship, every base, every defense platform. In 3 weeks. Actually, it was more like 2.5 weeks, Thorn said. We took a long weekend in the middle. Petrova here insists we stop by that nebula with the really pretty gas formations. You know, the one that looks like a giant space butterfly. The Azure Nebula, Petrova helpfully supplied. It's quite beautiful this time of year. The ambassador's scales had settled into what could only be described as existential crisis brown. This is impossible. What's impossible? Thorn asked. Could build ships that don't rely on brute force? Could develop tactics that don't involve flying straight at the enemy and hoping for the best? Could think strategically instead of just throwing more resources at a problem? He stood up, walking over to the viewport that looked out over the Kryll homeworld. It was actually quite beautiful. Sprawling cities connected by graceful bridges, orbital elevators stretching up into the sky like silver threads. The kind of architectural achievement that speaks to a species with vision and ambition. The thing is, Thorn said, his voice softer now, we didn't want to destroy your empire. We wanted to stop you from destroying ours. There's a difference. What happens now? Kryll asked. Thorn turned back to the table, where General Graken's skull was still serving as the galaxy's most morbid conversation piece. Now we talk about trade agreements, about mutual defense pacts, about the fact that the galaxy is a big place with room for everyone as long as everyone plays nice. And if we refuse? Thorn's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that perhaps that might not be the wisest course of action. Well, we got a lot of quantum tunnel drives and a really good understanding of your military capabilities. Or rather, your complete lack thereof. The ambassador's translator made a sound that might have been a sigh if insects could sigh. What are your terms? Oh, we're not the ones making terms, Thorn said, settling back into his chair with the air of someone who just finished a particularly satisfying game of chess. That's for the diplomats to figure out. I'm just here to make sure everyone understands the new reality. He gestured to the skull on the table. See, General Gracken here thought he was dealing with a primitive species that would roll over the moment they saw a big enough stick. He was wrong. Very wrong. Catastrophically wrong. I'm hoping you're a bit smarter than he was. We are, Keth'var said quickly. We are much smarter. Good. Because the last thing anyone wants is for this to escalate further. Trust me, what happened to your military was just us being polite. You really don't want to see what happens when humans stop being polite. Petrova stepped forward again, this time carrying a data pad of her own. Captain, Admiral Cross has asked me to inform you that the diplomatic team is ready to begin formal negotiations. They're prepared to offer the Keth'var people a very generous package. How generous? Thorn asked. Full autonomy over their internal affairs, protection under the Terran Defense Treaty, preferred trading status with human colonies, and a guaranteed seat on the Galactic Council once we establish one. Thorn raised an eyebrow. That is generous. Almost suspiciously generous. The Admiral's exact words were, "We don't want to rule anyone. We just want to make sure no one tries to rule us." Smart woman, Thorn said. He turned back to Keth'var. You hear that? We're not interested in conquering your worlds or enslaving your people. We're interested in making sure this kind of misunderstanding doesn't happen again. The ambassador's scales were slowly shifting to what might have been cautiously optimistic yellow. And the visual aid? Thorn looked down at the severed skull. Oh, this is just a reminder, a little memento to help everyone remember that actions have consequences. He picked it up and tossed it to Petrova, who caught it with the casual efficiency of someone who'd clearly handled strange things before. Petrova, see if you can find a nice box for this. Something dignified. Yes, sir. Any particular specifications? Something appropriate for the occasion. As Petrova left the room with her grisly cargo, Thorn turned back to the ambassador. So, Keth'var, can I call you Keth'var? What do you say we take this show on the road? The diplomats are waiting, and honestly, I've got a ship to run. Yes, I think that would be wise. Thorn grinned, the kind of grin that suggested he was truly enjoying himself. Outstanding. Oh, and Keth'var, word of advice for future reference. Next time you want to make an offer someone can't refuse, you might want to make sure it's actually a good offer. Turns out humans are really, really bad at doing things just because someone told them loudly. Part 2. The New Art of Diplomacy. The formal negotiations took place in the Keth'var capital's most prestigious conference center, a gleaming spire that rose above the city like a crystalline monument to accumulated efficiency. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Alara Vance, a woman who had the distinction of being both a skilled diplomat and someone who could probably stare down a supernova without flinching. Thorn wasn't officially part of the negotiations. He was technically just there to provide military context if needed, but he had a feeling his presence was doing more diplomatic work than half the actual diplomats. There was something about having the person who just dismantled an entire empire sitting quietly in the corner that focused people's attention on finding peaceful solutions. The Keth'var delegation was led by Chancellor Xylos, an elderly reptilian whose scales had the kind of deep, rich coloring that suggested either advanced age or really good genetics. He'd been polite but wary since the negotiations began, clearly trying to balance the need to save face with the reality that his species was now completely at the mercy of humanity's goodwill. The Terran terms are quite generous, Chancellor Xylos was saying, his translator doing a better job than Keth'var's had of making him sound dignified rather than desperate. Almost suspiciously so. Ambassador Vance nodded. We understand your caution, Chancellor. When one party has overwhelming military advantage, generous terms can seem like a trap. Are they? No, Vance said simply. They're just practical. We have no interest in governing your worlds, Chancellor. We have our own colonies to worry about. We have no need for your resources. Our technology is already more advanced than yours, and we have no desire to rule over people who don't want to be ruled. Then what do you want? It was Thorn who answered, his voice carrying the kind of casual certainty that came from someone who'd just proved their point in the most dramatic way possible. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. We want to make sure that next time someone decides to threaten humanity, word gets around that it's not a good idea. Chancellor Xylos's 4 eyes focused on Thorn with the kind of attention usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Captain Thorn, your reputation precedes you. I should hope so, Thorn said. I worked very hard on it. The destruction of our military was thorough. It was necessary. The Chancellor's voice carried just a hint of challenge. Surely a demonstration would have sufficed. A single fleet, perhaps, as a warning. Thorn leaned back in his chair, and for a moment the conference room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air recyclers. Chancellor, let me ask you something. If I destroyed just one fleet, what would you have done? We would have reassessed our position. Would you have called off the invasion? The Chancellor's scales shifted to what might have been uncomfortable honesty beige. We would have sent more fleets. How many more? As many as necessary. Thorn nodded. And how many of your people would have died in those fleets? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Chancellor Xylos's translator made a sound that might have been static or might have been the mechanical equivalent of a sigh. Millions, he said finally. Millions, Thorn agreed. See, the thing about demonstrating your capabilities is that it only works if the other side is smart enough to understand what they're seeing. Your military leadership looked at the destruction of the first fleet and decided it was a fluke. They looked at the loss of 3 more fleets and decided it was bad luck. It wasn't until we'd eliminated your entire military that they finally understood they were outmatched. You're saying you destroyed our empire to save lives? I'm saying I destroyed your military to prevent a war that would have killed millions of your people in thousands of hours. The empire part was just a side effect. Ambassador Vance stepped back into the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd had a lot of practice redirecting tense diplomatic moments. The point is, Chancellor, we're not here to reconcile the past. We're here to build a future that works for everyone. And this future involves the Keth'var people becoming a client state of the Terran Empire? There is no Terran Empire, Vance said firmly. There's the Terran Colonial Defense Force, which exists to protect human colonies from exactly the kind of threat your people represented. But we're not empire builders, Chancellor. We're problem solvers. What kind of problems? It was Petrova who answered this time, having returned from her errand with General Graken's skull, now secured in what appeared to be a very nice presentation box. The kind where everyone assumes that bigger is better, sir. The kind where military might is the only language anyone speaks. The kind where diplomacy is just something you do while you're building more ships. Chancellor Xylos's attention shifted to her. Lieutenant Commander Petrova, isn't it? You were instrumental in the tactical planning of the fleet actions. I was part of the team. Yes. Your analysis of our military capabilities was impressive and devastating. Petrova snapped. We're good at pattern recognition, sir. Your military follows the same tactical doctrine for every engagement. Once we understood the pattern, it was just a matter of being where you didn't expect us to be. And now, Petrova said, now we're here, talking instead of shooting, which is what we wanted from the beginning. Thorn stood up, walking over to the conference room's massive viewport. The Keth'var capital sprawled below them, millions of lights twinkling in the approaching dusk. It was beautiful in the way that all great cities were beautiful, a testament to intelligence, ambition, and the kind of collaborative effort that could only come from a species that had learned to work together. Chancellor, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes people listen. Your people built something amazing here. This city, this world, this civilization. It would have been a shame to destroy it. But you would have if you'd forced us to. Yes, but we would have taken no pleasure in it. Chancellor Xylos's scales shifted through several colors before settling on what might have been thoughtful contemplation purple. Captain Thorn, may I ask you a personal question? Shoot. When you first encountered our fleet, what was your initial reaction? Thorn considered this for a moment. Honest answer, I was impressed. 3,000 ships in perfect formation. All that firepower, the precision of the deployment. It was beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. And then, And then I realized you were planning to use all that beautiful, terrifying firepower to destroy human colonies full of people who'd never done anything to you. After that, it stopped being beautiful and started being a problem that needed solving. And General Graken? Thorne's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that the late general was still a bit of a sore subject. General Graken made the mistake of thinking that because humans were new to the galactic stage, we were primitive. He made the mistake of thinking that because we only sent one ship, we were weak. He made the mistake of thinking that because we tried to negotiate, we were afraid. And now General Graken is in a very nice box, and we're all sitting here having a civilized conversation about the future. Ambassador Vance stepped forward, her diplomat's instincts clearly telling her that this was a good moment to move the conversation in a more productive direction. The point is, Chancellor, we're offering your people a chance to be part of something bigger, a galactic community based on mutual respect and shared prosperity rather than conquest and domination. And if we refuse? Thorne turned back from the viewport, his expression mild, but his meaning clear. Then you refuse. We're not going to force you to join us, Chancellor. We're not going to invade your worlds or occupy your cities. We're just going to make sure you don't invade ours. You would simply leave us alone? We will leave you alone, Vance confirmed. But we would also make sure that every other species in the galaxy knows exactly what happened here. We will make sure that everyone understands that threatening human worlds is not a viable strategy for expansion. You will make us pariahs. We will make you irrelevant, Thorne said simply, which honestly is probably better than being pariahs. Pariahs get attention. Irrelevant civilizations get ignored. Chancellor Xylos' translator made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was hard to tell with alien technology. You have a very direct way of explaining things, Captain. I find it saves time. Very well. I believe we are ready to proceed with formal negotiations. The negotiations themselves were surprisingly straightforward. Once everyone understood the basic parameters, the KRYLL would maintain complete autonomy over their internal affairs, but would agree to certain restrictions on their military capabilities and expansion activities. In exchange, they would receive protection under the Terran Defense Treaty, preferred trading status with human colonies, and access to human technology that would help them rebuild their economy. It was, as Thorne had mentioned, a very generous package, almost suspiciously generous if you were the kind of person who believed that winning a war meant you got to dictate terms to the loser. But humans, as it turned out, were not that kind of people. They were the kind of people who won wars by making them too expensive to continue, and then offer the losers a better deal than they'd had before the war started. The technology transfer provisions are quite extensive, Chancellor Xylos noted, reviewing the draft agreement. Medical technology, agricultural improvements, industrial processes. This is worth trillions of credits. It's worth peace, Vance said, and peace is worth more than credits. Why? The Chancellor's question was genuine, carrying the kind of puzzled curiosity that came from someone trying to understand an alien mindset. Why offer us so much when you could simply take what you want? Thorne leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Chancellor, how many people live in this city? Approximately 40 million. And how many people live on your homeworld? Nearly 3 billion. And how many worlds do your species inhabit? 17, with colonies on 43 others. Thorne nodded. So we're talking about, what, maybe 20 billion KRYLL in total? Roughly, yes. Right. Now, here's the thing. Humans have been around for a while, and we've learned a few things about governance. One of the things we've learned is that ruling people who don't want to be ruled is really, really hard. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it usually ends badly for everyone involved. But you have the military capability to do it. We have the military capability to destroy your entire civilization, Thorne said. That's not the same thing as ruling it. Ruling requires cooperation, and cooperation requires trust. And trust requires people to believe that they're better off with you than without you. Chancellor Xylos' scales shifted to what might have been dawning understanding yellow. So the generous terms are an investment in trust. Vance finished. We're betting that if we treat you fairly, you'll treat us fairly. We're betting that if we help you rebuild, you'll help us maintain peace. We're betting that if we offer you partnership instead of domination, you'll choose partnership. And if your bet is wrong?" Thorn's expression didn't change, but his voice carried the kind of quiet certainty that made the temperature in the room seem to drop a few degrees. "Then we'll deal with that problem when it comes up." The rest of the negotiations progressed smoothly, with the kind of efficient professionalism that came from everyone understanding exactly where they stood. The KRYLL would dismantle their remaining military infrastructure, but would be allowed to maintain a small defense force for internal security. They would share intelligence about other potentially hostile species, but would not be required to participate in military actions. They would open their markets to human trade, but would maintain control over their own economic policies. It was, in short, exactly the kind of agreement that reasonable people might reach after a reasonable discussion about mutual interests. The fact that it had taken the complete destruction of one side's military to reach this point of reasonableness was just one of those things that nobody felt the need to mention explicitly. As the formal signing ceremony concluded, Thorn found himself standing next to Chancellor Xylos on the conference center's observation deck, looking out over the KRYLL capital as the sun set behind the towering spires. "Captain," the Chancellor said, "may I ask you another personal question?" "Sure. Do you believe this will work? This partnership between our species?" Thorn considered this for a moment, watching the lights of the city begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "I believe it has a chance, which is better than what we had 3 weeks ago. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else. That's what humans do, Chancellor. We try things, and if they don't work, we try different things. We keep trying till we find something that does work, even if it takes centuries. Even if it takes centuries." The Chancellor's translator made a sound that might have been thoughtful humming. "Your species is very patient for such aggressive warriors." Thorn laughed, the sound carrying across the observation deck. "Chancellor, we're not aggressive warriors. We're problem solvers who happen to be really good at breaking things when they need to be broken. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Oh, absolutely. Warriors fight because they like fighting. Problem solvers fight because they want the fighting to stop." "And which are you, Captain?" Thorn looked out over the city where millions of KRYLL were going about their evening routines, probably unaware that their entire civilization had just been restructured around a conference table. "I'm the guy who makes sure the problem solvers don't have to become warriors. By being a warrior yourself, by being whatever needs to be done." As they stood there in companionable silence, Petrova approached with a datapad and what appeared to be a slightly used expression. "Captain, we receive a message from Admiral Cross. Let me guess. She wants to know when we're coming home." "Actually, sir, she wants to know if you'd like to stay here for a while. Apparently, the Zepyrian Collective has been making some rather aggressive moves toward the Centauri colonies, and she thinks having you in the sector might discourage them from doing anything stupid." Thorn sighed. "The Zepyrians? Really? What is it with these alien species and their complete inability to learn from other people's mistakes?" "I couldn't say, sir, but Admiral Cross did mention that the Zepyrians have been asking a lot of questions about human military capabilities." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests they're planning to test those capabilities personally." Thorn turned to Chancellor Xylos, who was listening to this exchange with the kind of fascination that came from watching someone else's problems unfold in real time. "Chancellor, how well do you know the Zepyrians?" "Well enough to know that they're not as smart as they think they are," the Chancellor said. "They've been the local bullies in this sector for the past 50 years. Very fond of making demands and backing them up with overwhelming force." "Sounds familiar." "Indeed. The difference is we were at least competent bullies. The Zepyrians are less so." Thorn grinned. "This should be interesting." "Captain," Petrova said, "Admiral Cross also wanted me to tell you that the Horizon has been scheduled for a complete refit. New weapons, new defensive systems, new quantum tunnel drives. Apparently, the engineering team has some ideas about improving our tactical capabilities." "How much improvement are we talking about?" "Well, sir, the preliminary reports suggest we should be able to handle larger fleets with even greater efficiency." Thorn looked out over the KRYLL capital one more time then turned back to his aide. Petrova, send a message to Admiral Cross. Tell her we'll be staying in the sector for a while. And send a message to the Zephyrian Collective. What should it say, sir? Tell them we'd like to have a chat. Chancellor Xylo's scales shifted to what might have been anticipatory amusement purple. Captain, would you like some advice about dealing with the Zephyrians? I'm all ears. They're very impressed by dramatic gestures. They respond well to shows of force. Thorn grinned. The kind of grin that suggested he was already planning something that would probably end up in several different species' military history books. Chancellor, I think this is going to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. As the three of them walked back toward the conference center, Petrova couldn't help but ask the question that had been bothering her since the negotiations began. Captain, can I ask you something? Shoot. Why didn't we just destroy the KRYLL civilization completely? It would have been easier than all these negotiations. Thorn stopped walking, his expression becoming serious in a way that made both Petrova and Chancellor Xylos pay attention. Petrova, destroying things is easy. Any idiot with enough firepower can blow up a planet. But building something, creating something that lasts, that's hard. That takes intelligence and cooperation and the kind of long-term thinking that most species seem to have trouble with. So, we're trying to build something? We're trying to build peace, Thorn said. Real peace, not just the absence of war. The kind of peace where everyone benefits, where everyone has a stake in keeping things stable, where everyone has too much to lose to risk going back to the old ways. And if it doesn't work? Thorn's grin returned, carrying with it the kind of confidence that came from someone who'd just proven they could solve problems that other people considered unsolvable. Then we'll try something else. But Petrova, here's the thing about humans that most alien species don't understand. We're really, really good at learning from our mistakes. And we're even better at making sure we don't have to make the same mistake twice. Part 3. The Prompt Lesson. 3 days later, the Zephyrian Collective received a message that would go down in their historical records as either the most polite declaration of war ever written or the most terrifying peace offering in galactic history. Greetings to the Zephyrian Collective. The message began, delivered by a human who looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster for some sort of military organization that specialized in making other military organizations nervous. My name is Captain Kalen Thorn, representing the Terran Colonial Defense Force. We understand you've been asking questions about human military capabilities. The message was being received by Supreme Commander Vorag, a massive reptilian being whose scales had the kind of deep emerald coloring that suggested either excellent genetic health or a really good genetics program. He was flanked by his senior staff, all of whom were displaying the kind of professional interest that came from career military officers watching a potential enemy make what might be either a mistake or a masterstroke. We're always happy to answer questions, Thorn continued, his tone carrying the kind of casual friendliness that somehow made the words sound more threatening than if he'd been shouting. In fact, we thought we might provide a demonstration. Supreme Commander Vorag's tongue flicked out, tasting the air in the way that reptilian species did when they were either nervous or excited. Demonstration? We understand you've been conducting military exercises near the Centauri colonies, Thorn said. Impressive formations, by the way. Very symmetrical. We thought we might conduct some exercises of our own. The message paused, and Thorn's expression shifted to something that might have been a smile if smiles were weapons of psychological warfare. We've taken the liberty of positioning the horizon in your home system. Nothing aggressive, you understand? Just a friendly visit. Every alarm on the Zephyrian command ship began screaming at once. Sensors. Supreme Commander Vorag barked. Where is it? Unknown, sir, came the reply from the sensor operator, whose voice had the kind of pitch that suggested he was having some sort of biological crisis. We're detecting quantum disturbances throughout the system, but we can't get a lock on any solid contacts. How is that possible? We don't know, sir. The message continued, oblivious to the chaos it was causing. We thought you might be interested in seeing what human military capabilities actually look like. Consider this an educational opportunity. What happened next will be studied in military academies across the galaxy for the next century. although most of the analysis would focus on the psychological aspects rather than the tactical ones. The tactical aspects were frankly too depressing for most military minds to contemplate. The Horizon had indeed positioned itself in the Zephyrian home system, but not in any way that conventional military thinking could comprehend. Instead of taking a position outside the system's defensive perimeter or even maintaining a safe distance from the Zephyrian fleet, the human vessel had done something that was either brilliant or completely insane. It had quantum tunneled directly into the middle of the Zapparon capital ship. Not next to it, not near it, into it. The Horizon was currently occupying the same space as the ZCS Dominator, the pride of the Zephyrian fleet, in a way that should have been physically impossible, but was apparently just another Tuesday for human engineering. "Sir," the sensor operator said, his voice now reaching frequencies that most species use for emergency communications. "The human vessel it's inside our hull." "What do you mean inside our hull?" "I mean, it's occupying the same physical space as our ship, sir. It's like they're existing in parallel dimensions, but we can see them on internal sensors." Supreme Commander Vorag had been in the military for 40 years. He'd fought in 3 major wars, commanded fleets in battles across a dozen star systems, and earned a reputation as one of the finest tactical minds in Zephyrian space. None of that had prepared him for the sight of a human warship casually floating through his flagship's engineering section like it was taking a tour. "How?" he asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. Quant phase technology, came a new voice from the communication system. It was Captain Thorn, and he sounded like he was enjoying himself immensely. "We're existing in a slightly different quantum state than your ship. Same space, different dimensional frequency. Very useful for close-range negotiations." "This is impossible." "I know, right? Our engineers said the same thing when we first developed it. But you know what they say about human engineering. If it works, it's not stupid." The Supreme Commander's scales were beginning to shift to a color that probably didn't exist in nature. "What do you want?" "Just a chat, really. We heard you were interested in testing human military capabilities, and we thought we'd save you the trouble. Consider this a preview of what you'd be facing if you decide to make any aggressive moves toward human colonies." "You're threatening us." "Oh no," Thorne said, his tone suggesting that the Supreme Commander had somehow missed the point entirely. "We're educating you. There's a difference. A threat implies that we're going to do something bad to you. Education implies that we're helping you understand why doing something bad to us would be a mistake." Supreme Commander Vorag looked around his command center where his senior staff were all staring at the tactical displays with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who just realized they were standing in the middle of a minefield. "You're inside our flagship," he said, his voice carrying the kind of strained calm that came from someone who was trying very hard not to panic. "You could destroy us at any moment." "We could," Thorne agreed cheerfully. "But that would be rude. We're guests in your star system, after all. It would be terrible manners to blow up our hosts." "Then what do you want?" "We want to make sure you understand the new reality, Supreme Commander. See, the galaxy has changed quite a bit recently. The Keth'var Empire, for example, decided to test human military capabilities. They're not an empire anymore." The Supreme Commander's tongue flicked out again, this time in what was definitely a nervous gesture. "What happened to them?" "They became our partners," Thorne said. "Very enthusiastic partners once they understood the alternatives. Lovely people, really. Great cities, impressive technology, excellent trade opportunities. I think you'd like them. You conquered them. We liberated them from the burden of having to maintain a military they couldn't afford," Thorne corrected. "Very different things. Much more cost-effective for everyone involved." The Supreme Commander was beginning to understand that he was dealing with someone who had a very different definition of normal military operations. "Captain Thorne, what exactly are you advocating?" "I'm suggesting that we have a civilized conversation about your future plans regarding human colonies," Thorne said. "I'm advocating that we discuss the benefits of peaceful coexistence versus the alternative. I'm prejudging that we avoid the kind of unpleasantness that led to the KRYLL situation. And if we refuse..." The communication system was quiet for a moment, though the tactical displays were still showing the impossible sight of a human warship casually occupying the same space as their flagship. "Supreme Commander," Thorne said finally, his voice carrying the kind of patient tone that teachers use when explaining something to particularly slow students. "You're a military officer. You understand tactics, strategy, the importance of choosing your battles wisely. So, let me ask you a tactical question. What would you do if you were in my position?" The Supreme Commander considered this. He was inside his own flagship, surrounded by his entire fleet in his own star system, with every defensive platform and orbital station ready to support him. The human vessel was alone, outnumbered by thousands to one, completely surrounded by hostile forces. And yet somehow he felt like he was the one who was trapped. "I would negotiate," he said finally. "Excellent." Thorne's voice brightened considerably. "I was hoping you'd say that. Negotiations are so much more civilized than the alternative. And between you and me, Supreme Commander, the alternative is really quite unpleasant. What are your terms?" "Oh, we're not the ones making terms," Thorne said. "We're just here to facilitate the conversation. The actual negotiations will be handled by our diplomatic team, who are standing by to beam over at your convenience." "Beam over?" "Quantum transportation. Very safe, very efficient. Although, I should mention, our diplomatic team travels with a small security detail. Just standard procedures. You understand." Supreme Commander Vorag had a feeling that the human definition of small security detail was probably not the same as the Zephyrian definition. "How small?" "Oh, just a few hundred Marines. Nothing too intimidating." "A few hundred? Well, we want to make sure our diplomats are safe," Thorne said reasonably. "And our Marines are very professional. They'll hardly be noticeable." The Supreme Commander looked around his command center, where his senior staff were all waiting for orders that he was increasingly certain he didn't want to give. "Captain Thorne," he said, "I believe we are prepared to begin negotiations." "Outstanding. I'll let the diplomatic team know. They'll be so pleased." "Oh, and Supreme Commander." "Yes. Welcome to the new galaxy. I think you're going to like it here." The negotiations with the Zephyrian collective proceeded even more smoothly than the ones with the KRYLL. Partly because the Zephyrians had the benefit of learning from the KRYLL's example, and partly because having a human warship literally occupying the same space as your flagship concentrated the mind on finding peaceful solutions to problems. The final agreement was similar to the one reached with the KRYLL, though with a few modifications to account for the Zephyrians' different cultural and economic needs. They would maintain local autonomy, receive protection under the Terran Defense Treaty, and gain access to human technology and markets. In exchange, they would refrain from aggressive expansion and would contribute to the maintenance of galactic peace. It was, as Thorne had mentioned to Chancellor Xylos, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. 6 months later, Captain Thorne found himself back on Earth, standing in Admiral Cross's office and trying to explain why his simple reconnaissance mission had somehow resulted in the creation of what the media was calling the Terran Peace Initiative. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Admiral Cross said, reviewing the reports with the kind of expression that suggested she was trying very hard not to laugh. "You were sent to scout one enemy fleet, and you came back with 2 new allied civilizations and a plan to restructure galactic politics?" "That's a bit of an oversimplification," Thorne said, "but essentially accurate. And this plan involves positioning human vessels throughout the galaxy as, what did you call them? Peace enforcement specialists." "The terminology is still being worked out," Thorne admitted, "but the basic idea is sound. We maintain a small but highly visible presence in key systems, and we make sure that everyone understands the benefits of peaceful coexistence by demonstrating what happens when they don't choose peaceful coexistence." "By providing educational opportunities," Thorne corrected. "There's a difference." Admiral Cross set down the reports and looked at Thorne with the kind of expression that suggested she was trying to decide whether to promote him or have him evaluated by the fleet psychologists. "Captain, do you realize what you've done? I've prevented several wars, established beneficial trade relationships with 2 major civilizations, and created a framework for galactic peace that could last for centuries. You've made humanity the de facto police force of the galaxy. Thorn considered this. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is a lot of responsibility. Good thing we're good at it. Admiral Cross leaned back in her chair, and for a moment, Thorn wondered if she was going to start laughing or start shouting. Instead, she did something that was somehow more unsettling than either option. She smiled. "Captain Thorn," she said, "how do you feel about a promotion?" And that's how Captain Kalen Thorn became Admiral Kalen Thorn, commander of the newly formed Terran Peace Initiative, and the person responsible for making sure that the galaxy remains a place where reasonable people could have reasonable conversations about their differences, even if those conversations occasionally require the presence of quantum-phase warships to keep everyone focused on being reasonable. The galaxy, as it turned out, was a much more peaceful place when everyone understood that starting wars was bad for business, bad for health, and bad for the kind of long-term thinking that led to successful civilizations. Of course, there were still species who needed to learn this lesson the hard way. The Vraxian hegemony, for example, had some very strong opinions about human expansion into their sector. The Crystalline Collective had been making some rather aggressive claims, and there were rumors about something called the Dark Fleet that was supposedly planning to cleanse the galaxy of inferior species. But Admiral Thorn wasn't worried about any of that. After all, he had the finest ships in the galaxy, the most advanced technology in human history, and a proven track record of solving problems that other people considered unsolvable. And if that wasn't enough, he still had General Graken's skull in a very nice presentation box, ready to serve as a conversation starter for anyone who needed a reminder about the benefits of choosing diplomacy over warfare. The galaxy was a big place full of interesting people and fascinating cultures. And as long as everyone remembers to play nice, it will continue to be a place where reasonable people could have reasonable conversations about their differences. Of course, if anyone forgot to play nice, well, that's what the Terran Peace Initiative was for. After all, peace was too important to leave to chance. The end.